Man, it's just no use. I won't even wipe my...
Hey, it's McDonnie. Listen, it's over. Suppose it's finished.
What about Paul?
Hey, you're not pushing your luck now.
Hit me.
22. Better luck next time.
I have nothing left. Except Spider-Man.
Hey, welcome back to the stash. Zeb Wells' The Amazing Spider-Man has been hailed by comic fans as the worst Spider-Man series to ever exist. With the volume finally completed at issue 60, yes, somehow he made it to 60 issues, Zeb Wells has managed to undo and damage so much of the Spider-Man mythos. From ruining Peter and MJ's relationship to introducing Paul and even Wreck-Rap to assassinating quite literally every single character he touched, his bad writing knew no bounds. So join us today as we go over Zeb's horrific time as the writer of The Amazing Spider-Man. But before we get into that, I want to take a quick second to say a massive thank you for all the support recently, because here at the Stash, we reached 4,000 subscribers, and I thought, you know, what's a better way to celebrate than go over the worst Spidey run in history? So I really hope you all do enjoy this video, and yep, thank you guys again for the support. Onwards to 5,000 subscribers. I can't believe I'm even saying that. A prime example of Zeb just ruining this comic is the way he makes the main character of this series, Spider-Man, basically just a random nobody. This is shown clear as day in multiple story arcs. One in particular that always bothered me was Gang War. During that depressing time, the story was basically centered around Janice and Tombstone, rather than, you know, who the book is actually named after. And Spidey in the Gang War story would sometimes barely appear within the issues, and when he did, he just got insulted by Kingpin or Tombstone or the heroes he was supposed to be on the same team with. You see, maybe I'd sing a different tune if the story wasn't so sloppily put together. You can have a Spider-Man comic feature a plot that's not predominantly centering him, but in the context of how Zeb used Peter, not just in this but even throughout, it just didn't blend together at all. You know, it came off more of just an excuse for him not to have to write Spider-Man. One panel that still always pops up into my head is when Spidey just tried to get involved with Fisk and Lonnie's fight, only for the Kingpin to literally smack him out of the way as if he's just an annoying bug. The grown-ups are talking. Need I remind you? In fact, his treatment of Spidey overall is just horrendous. You know, he's fully turned this once strong and inspiring hero into nothing more than a weak, ineffectual moron who's too scared to stand up for himself and just constantly gets belittled by everyone in the series. I'm not kidding when I say that Zeb Wells wrote Spider-Man to be beaten within an inch of his life on multiple occasions, from Silvermane to Tombstone and somehow to the Vulture. Tombstone even made Spider-Man beg for mercy. And we really can't forget how Aunt Anna somehow managed to embarrass Spider-Man in a fight. Literally, it's almost impressive how with each new release he had, we were always hitting a new low. And of course, to make matters worse, Peter would need someone like Norman Osborn to come in and save his life pretty much every single time he got into a fight when they were working together. Which takes us to my next point, Norman Osborn. Now, Norman Osborn in this comic is very different than what we're used to, and I'm not saying that anything different is bad, but trust me on this one, this change, it's pretty bad, okay? It's annoying too because it could have been a half decent concept if it was just written properly, but it is Zeb Wells. I'm sure you all know by now if you're familiar with this run, but basically for a large majority of the comic book, Norman Osborn, cleansed of his sins, was on the side of good for a change, and Peter throughout this time would become quite close with him, almost forming a father-son bond with Osborn. Need I remind you? There's just so much wrong with this aspect of his run, and I really don't know where to begin? I guess if we take a look at what I count one of Zeb's worst blunders throughout the entire series, because it's pretty bad. There's this one scene where Peter tells Norman that, in short, he believes he's on the right path to becoming the old Norman Osborn who was like a father to him, the Norman before the Goblin Serum. Now, if you're a Spider-Man fan who's actually read the comics and not just watched the movies, I'm sure you can see why this is a problem. Peter has never met Norman before he became the Goblin, except for 2 retcons. One was a flashback issue in Peter Parker's Spider-Man, which was a brief encounter between the two when he was a kid, and the next one was Shadow of the Green Goblin, which was a mini-series that was released this year. A mini-series which showed that even before he was under the Goblin Serum, Norman was still a very, very horrible person. If that's not enough to shame Zeb's clear laziness and lack of effort when researching the lore of the character he's writing, then let's take a look back to the Chip Zdarsky run when he was doing Spectacular Spider-Man. In issue 301, Peter goes back in time and basically helps his younger self defeat all his villains. So when we get to the Green Goblin, present day Peter unmasks him and the young Peter says, and I quote, "Who's that?" So even if you ignore the retcons overlapping each other, the general basis within the Spider-Man comic mythos is that Norman Osborn was not only always a monster, but also someone Peter never really had a bond with. I noticed this as a constant theme throughout Zeb's time on the book. The man seems to have only watched the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. It's painfully evident and honestly embarrassing for him, considering he's got the privilege of being the writer for Amazing Spider-Man, the title of Spider-Man. I mean, he tried to make Tombstone Kingpin, or the big man if you will, like in the show, and he did it in a way that just completely humiliated Spidey. Spider-Man in that last story arc was so unbelievably weak. You know, Lonnie can be tough, don't get me wrong, but for him to be this one-man army was just a whole different level of bullshit. It really made Spider-Man look like this pathetic C-lister who almost died by the hands of a C-lister villain on many occasions throughout this entire run. Not to mention that story actually ended with nothing really getting resolved. Like, Lonnie literally walked free through just, again, some bullshit because Zeb Wells was just too lazy to do the slightest bit of research within the Marvel world because he completely ignored Matt Murdock's iconic Supreme Court win, which allowed superheroes to be useful in court. They can testify, they can stand trial without having to remove their mask. But he just ignored it completely and pretended like that never happened. You know what, for this next part, I'm just going to smack all these complaints under the same thing because you just cannot talk about one and not talk about the other. So I present to you It's bad enough that the original What Did Peter Do plot was stretched out to 25 issues, but the fact that after another 35 issues, pretty much nothing gets added or solved for that matter, it just makes it all the more infuriating. Now that I think about it, the only thing that's worth of note is that it took Mary Jane up until the very last issue for her to even give Peter a somewhat sincere thank you, which is instantly invalid the moment you remember that she treated him like absolute trash for the entirety of this run. Peter worked night and day to get her back. He ruined relationships with family, friends, everyone, all to get the love of his life to return home, and what does she do when he finally does that? She gives him the cold shoulder, treat him like a crazy stalker, and leave him for Paul. Wow, brilliant writing there, Zeb. What a convoluted mess you had to try to create to justify your shocking reasoning to break them up. I mean, how convenient that for MJ, a month or two was 4 years within that dimension. How convenient indeed. But before we continue further at the Paul dilemma, I want to quickly go over just how horribly written the Fantastic Four was during the entire, what did Peter do plot? I mean, the Human Torch probably copped it the worst though. He was a total asshole towards Peter when he explained his whole, MJ is trapped in a dimension situation. You really think that for Johnny, he'd be able to actually emphasize with his good close friend that he's had for years, considering his experience of being trapped and technically dying in the negative zone. You would think that something like that would allow the Torch to properly understand the severity of the entire situation and the need to rescue MJ as soon as possible. But no, instead we get this. Johnny and Ben treating Peter like he's just some criminal. Who cares if Peter's their best friend and in many ways the most important extra member / ally of the Fantastic Four who desperately needs help? Who needs good writing when you can just have forced drama? If Zeb was actually a competent writer, then Johnny and Ben would have just given Peter basically all the help he would really need without hesitation. I generally can't stand how out of character he wrote the Fantastic Four in this. Going through these issues again should be classified as a form of torture. But now that I got that out of my system, back to the MJ Paul nonsense. So, the fake kids. You know, who remembers those brats? One of the major key reasons as to why Paul and MJ even stayed together in the first place. And, of course, when they died, it changed nothing. You know the state of your comic is bad when the fandom all actively rejoiced on Twitter after that got leaked. It was one of the most insane days I think I had on that website, where just piles and piles of tweets were just flooding in, celebrating the fact that these two fictional children had finally disappeared. This entire story though, the one with when Paul's dad came back and the kids disappeared, and Miss Marvel's death, you know, how she got shoehorned into the book so many times, it was insane. But it was just yet another complete mess, one of many, by Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe, with their hatred for Mary Jane being as present as ever. Especially in that plot, it was crazy because throughout it, she'd have a certain nickname given to her by Rabin, the name being Scarlet Woman. Yeah, I think you can see what they meant by this. It's honestly so shallow from these hacks. They make it painfully obvious they absolutely hate Mary Jane. You know, her character assassination within this volume is nothing short than criminal. From the way she treats Peter, to her being with Paul, to the entire jackpot thing, and much, much more. It's safe to say that readers of the once great ASM now can't even recognize Mary Jane Watson as a character anymore. She's completely different. It's just so sad because, as you can tell by now, I love MJ. In Spidey comics, she's easily my favorite side character, especially during their marriage era, whether it be during JMS's time in the book, or David Michelin, or even JMD Mateus. The Pete and MJ aspect of those stories were always a highlight for me. They used to be each other's rock. They used to be madly in love. They used to be the greatest couple in comic history. But at this point, we all know why Zeb's done this. It's not just because of the editorial guidelines, it's because of his divorce. Now, take this next part with a grain of salt. You know, I'm almost speculating here, however, the sources for the information relating to the split up are pretty reliable, and honestly, given the context of this entire run, it makes sense. You know, it just does. With the stuff like the whole Scarlet Woman garbage, MJ being an asshole, the original Goblin Sin situation, and even with that comment made by Aunt Anna in one issue saying that MJ is at fault for them splitting up this time, even though she's both her niece and basically her daughter. It becomes super obvious that this is just Zeb indirectly calling his ex out through his work, and only doing so because of pure nepotism. And honestly, it's pathetic. Go get real therapy instead of just ruining everyone's favorite comic book couple. Comics are meant to be a form of escape from the real world, and doing what he's done to this series goes completely against that. And now that this run is over, all it means is that soon someone will just come in to be the new writer and just ignore it completely. You know, it'll just gloss over it like how he did to Nick Spencer. And the only thing that this volume will actually be remembered as is just yet another guy throwing a massive tantrum because of their relationship, and in the process, ruining Spider-Man and his wonderful cast of characters. I really can't wait for the day Paul's forever banished from the comics. The only reason he exists, the only purpose he serves for this comic, is to literally keep Peter and MJ separated. Man, oh man, you've done it again, Zeb. What a creation you have on your hands. Mind you, Paul aided genocide, yet MJ and even the editor of the book doesn't seem to actually care. Well, actually, according to Nick Lowe, we the fans just read the book wrong. That's all we do apparently to him. We read the stories incorrectly, we don't understand Spider-Man, we don't know what's right for the character, and so on. Wow, what a top guy. I'm sure glad he's in charge of Spider-Man comics, a babbling hypocritical buffoon whose only real accomplishment besides helping Zeb ruin these comics is writing Wolverine to be a pedophile. You know, now's as good a time as any considering we're on the topic about ruining Spider-Man characters, so how about what this volume did to Ben Reilly? Okay, it was bad enough that he was running around as this crazed villain Chasm, hell-bent on killing Peter, but what makes it so much worse is that Zeb Wells, within his own run, set up a possible mini redemption arc for Ben, and then took all the progress away. After the results of, I think, his second story arc within this series, it got him a mini-series, and I believe in that, he actually made some positive steps to becoming a hero again. So what does Zeb do? You know, what does he do for no reason at all? He brings Ben back for the final issue in one of the backup stories and regresses his character to being a psycho who wants to kill Peter again. Why? Man, back in the 90s, there was just a certain point where we were so close to having it all. We really were. We went from Peter and MJ, preparing to have their daughter, Ben Reilly being his normal self, and him and Peter almost forming a brotherly bond, you know, having Mayday was gonna have her own Uncle Ben. We went from that to MJ ditching Peter for Paul, and Ben going crazy and as Chasm wanting to desperately murder Spider-Man. I know that this video is probably insanely messy, but when talking about an era such as the Zeb Wells run, it just sort of fits the overall theme of the comic. I could honestly talk about how infuriating this run is for hours on end, but I really tried to condense it for the video and get the main points in. In short though, I hate this run. I hate everything it's done to Spider-Man and the lore, I hate everything it stands for. I just can't stand this volume. This is worse than the Dan Slott era. This is worse than One More Day. This is as low as we have ever gotten. This volume knew no bounds. Quite literally every character it touched was somehow ruined. Ben and Johnny acted like complete jerks to Peter. Mary Jane treated Peter like shit and left him for Paul. Paul, well, he's Paul. Aunt May acted like she didn't even know her nephew. Aunt Anna constantly talked shit about her niece. Doc Ock reduced to an annoying parody of his 1960s self. Ben Reilly, a maniac who's hellbent on killing Peter. Spider-Man himself, a loser man-child who's constantly belittled or made fun of, and a once powerful force reduced to this weak pushover who can't even beat anyone that comes in his way without help from someone else. Seriously, this is pathetic. What an abomination of a comic. What a waste of 60 issues. What a waste of 2 whole years. Zeb Wells, you ruined my and millions of others' favorite comic series. I hope you never ever return within the rest of your embarrassing career to write another Spidey comic, because this run, from start to finish, was garbage. It was offensive even. And when the dust settles, when this volume is far behind us, all you'll be remembered as is the lazy excuse of a writer who killed the once legendary comic series, The Amazing Spider-Man.